The cafeteria noise stopped instantly when Nellie placed her tray opposite Caleb. In the ecosystem of Oak Creek Elementary, Caleb was the storm everyone steered around, an unpredictable force of anger. Nellie was the opposite. She was the shadow, the observer who moved without displacing the air. When she sat down in the exclusion zone surrounding him, the silence was heavy. The adults saw a victim walking into a trap, but Nellie saw something else entirely. To understand why she sat down, we have to understand the silence she lived in. Nellie's world was built on the architecture of invisibility. She had learned early that in a school bursting at the seams, safety was found in the margins. Oak Creek was a place of peeling paint and fluorescent hums, a failing system where teachers were outnumbered and patience was a resource that ran dry by mid-morning. Here, being good simply meant being quiet, and Nellie excelled at this. She watched the world from the corners, her sketchbook a shield against the chaos. The school itself felt like a pressure cooker. The hallways were narrow, crowded with bodies that bumped and shoved, creating a constant low-level friction. For a child like Nellie, the noise was physical. It vibrated in her teeth. The cafeteria was the epicenter, a cavernous room where the smell of bleach fought a losing battle against the scent of reheated pizza and adolescent sweat. In this environment, the teachers were more like wardens than educators. They moved with clipboards and whistles, their eyes scanning for trouble, not for distress. They missed things. They missed the way Nellie's hand shook when she held a pencil. They missed the way Caleb's eyes darted toward the exits every time a door opened. Then there was Caleb. If Nellie was the shadow, Caleb was the flare. He was the problem child, the name that made teachers sigh before they even opened the file. To the staff, he was a collection of incidents, overturned desks, shouting matches, recess fights. He was a disruption to be managed, a fire to be contained. The adults looked at Caleb and saw defiance. They saw a boy who refused to listen, who took up too much time, who made a difficult job impossible. Their strategy was containment, detention, suspension, voices raised to match his own. They were exhausted, and in their exhaustion, they stopped looking for the cause and focused only on the symptom. There was a narrative about Caleb that had solidified by the third grade. He was bad news. Teachers warned each other about him in the break room. Good luck with that one, they would say, passing the burden along like a hot coal. This expectation created a feedback loop. Because they expected a fight, they approached him with armor up, voices already hard. They didn't ask him why he hadn't done his homework. They assumed he didn't care. They didn't ask why he was sleeping in class. They assumed he was lazy. They treated his behavior as a character flaw rather than a distress signal. And Caleb, sensing their resignation, played the role he was given. If they thought he was a monster, he would show them teeth. It was easier to be feared than to be misunderstood. But Nellie watched him with a different lens. While the other students saw a bully to avoid and the teachers saw a liability to remove, Nellie saw the small, telling fractures in the armor. She noticed that his anger rarely started at zero. It was a reaction, a defense. She saw the way he wore the same hooded sweatshirt 3 days in a row, the cuffs frayed and stained. She noticed that he didn't just jump when a locker slammed nearby. He braced himself, his shoulders rising toward his ears in a reflex that spoke of a home life where sudden noises meant danger. She saw the hunger in his posture, not just for food, though that was there too, but a starving need for stability. When the principal lectured him in the hallway, looming tall and loud, Nellie didn't see a defiant brat. She saw a cornered animal waiting for the strike. She saw his hands ball into fists not to punch, but to hold himself together. The system was designed to crush the noise out of him, but Nellie understood that the noise was just a signal. The adults were trying to break a wall that was actually a dam holding back a flood. It was this specific attention to detail, this ability to read the language of trauma that had no words, that made her stop walking. The fracture point arrived on a Tuesday, amidst the chaotic symphony of 300 students unwrapping sandwiches and shouting across laminate tables. It began with a sound that cut through the ambient roar like a gunshot, the sharp, distinct clatter of hard plastic hitting the linoleum, followed immediately by the dull thud of heavy textbooks. Near the disposal line, a first grader had stopped too abruptly, and Caleb, pacing like a caged tiger behind him, had collided with the smaller boy. It was an accident of physics, a simple matter of momentum and overcrowding, but in the volatile ecosystem of Oak Creek Elementary, intent didn't matter. The result was a sprawl of books, a spilled carton of milk, and a younger child looking up with wide, watery eyes. The cafeteria went silent. It wasn't a gradual hush. It was an instantaneous vacuum, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. Every head turned. The air in the room seemed to crystallize, freezing everyone in place. In that stillness, the narrative that the school had written for Caleb instantly took over. He wasn't a boy who had tripped. He was the aggressor. He was the problem. "Caleb!" The shout came from Mr. Henderson, the lunch duty monitor, whose voice carried the gravelly weight of a man who had stopped seeing children and started seeing threats. He was already moving across the room, his finger pointing like an accusation before he had even assessed the damage. "Get away from him, now!" The reaction from Caleb was visceral. He didn't apologize or try to help the younger boy up. Instead, he kicked a nearby chair, sending it skidding across the floor with a screech that made half the room flinch. His shoulders hijacked his ears, his hands balled into white-knuckled fists, and his face contorted into a mask of pure defensive fury. "I didn't do anything!" he screamed back, his voice cracking. But the defense sounded like an attack. This was the dance they all knew. The adult shouted, the boy exploded, and the cycle of punishment began. The other students shrank back, creating a wide berth around the epicenter of the trouble, leaving Caleb stranded on an island of spilled milk and judgment. This was the moment the script demanded escalation. Security would be called. Caleb would be dragged to the office. The file would grow thicker. But Nellie moved. She didn't stand up with a grand declaration. She didn't shout at Mr. Henderson to stop. She simply picked up her tray. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but her face remained a smooth, unreadable mask. While the rest of the student body retreated, pulling their legs in and turning their backs to avoid the blast radius, Nellie walked straight into the center of the room. The sound of her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor was the only noise in the room aside from Caleb's ragged breathing. She walked past the frozen teachers, past the weeping first grader being ushered away by an aide, and stopped at the empty table where Caleb had retreated. He was standing with his back to the wall, vibrating with adrenaline, his eyes darting around for the next threat. When Nellie placed her tray on the table, the plastic click sounded impossibly loud. She sat down. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at Mr. Henderson, who had stopped mid-stride, his mouth hanging slightly open in confusion. She simply arranged her napkin, opened her milk carton, and began to eat. The space she occupied was charged with electricity. Sitting this close to Caleb felt like sitting next to a live wire. She could smell him, not just the scent of unwashed clothes and stale smoke, but the metallic tang of fear. She could hear the hitch in his breathing, a jagged rhythm that sounded less like rage and more like someone trying not to drown. Caleb stared at her. His fists were still clenched, his chest heaving. He had prepared for a fight, for shouting, for physical restraint. He had no defense against a quiet girl eating lunch. Nellie reached into her lunch bag. Her hand moved slowly, telegraphing every inch of the motion so as not to startle him. She pulled out a red apple, its skin bruised slightly near the stem. Without a word, without looking up from her tray, she slid it across the table. It rolled with a soft rumble over the laminate and came to a stop just inches from his clenched fist. It wasn't a gift, and it wasn't a bribe. It was an observation. She had seen him eyeing the trash cans earlier. She knew the difference between bad and hungry. She took another bite of her carrot, the crunch echoing in the quiet, and waited. The ball was in his court, but for the first time in his life, the game had changed rules. The apple sat on the gray laminate like a challenge. For Caleb, this was the moment where the trap usually snapped shut. In his experience, nothing was ever given freely. Gifts were just debts waiting to be collected, or worse, setups for a punchline he wouldn't understand until everyone was laughing. He stared at the fruit, then at Nellie, his eyes narrowed into slits of suspicion. He was waiting for the lecture. He was waiting for her to tell him to behave, or to ask him why he was so mean, or to deliver a message from a teacher. He was waiting for the price. But Nellie didn't speak. She didn't even look at him. She simply continued to chew her carrot, her gaze fixed on a scratch in the table, offering him the one thing he had never been granted in that building: anonymity. She wasn't watching him perform. She wasn't demanding he change. She was simply existing in his space, without fear. His hand shot out. It was a snatch, a reflex of someone who expects things to be taken away if they aren't claimed immediately. He didn't polish the apple. He didn't inspect it. He brought it to his mouth and bit down with a ferocity that made Nellie pause mid-chew. It wasn't the way a child eats a snack during a break. It was the way a survivor consumes rations. In 3 bites, half the apple was gone. He didn't breathe between swallows. From the periphery, the adults were watching. Mr. Henderson had lowered his finger but hadn't moved his feet. To him, this looked like a hostage situation, a volatile delinquent looming over a defenseless girl. They saw aggression in his hunched shoulders, missing the reality that he was hunching to protect the food, shielding it with his body as if the air itself might steal it back. Nellie saw the trembling in his fingers that had nothing to do with rage. The monster of Oak Creek Elementary was just a boy running on empty fumes. The bell rang, shattering the bubble. Caleb flinched, the apple core now just a few seeds in his palm. He looked at Nellie, his eyes wide, realizing he had just eaten her food. He braced himself for the regret or the accusation. "See you," Nellie whispered. It was barely audible, lost under the screech of 300 chairs pushing back. She stood up, took her tray, and walked away. No sermon, no pity, just a fact. The next day, the cafeteria was waiting. The students watched, the teachers hovered, ready to intervene at the slightest provocation. Nellie walked past her usual table, past her friends who waved her over, and sat down across from him again. This time, she brought an extra bag of pretzels. She slid them across the table before she even sat down. Caleb didn't snatch them this time. He looked at the bag, then at her, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Why?" he grunted. His voice was rusty, unused to quiet questions. "I don't like pretzels," she lied. They sat in silence. It became a ritual. Tuesday became Wednesday, and Wednesday became a week. The silence between them changed texture. It went from a tense, wire-tight standoff to a comfortable, shared solitude. They were two outcasts building a shelter in the middle of a war zone. For 20 minutes a day, Caleb didn't have to fight. He just had to eat. And for 20 minutes a day, Nellie didn't have to be invisible. She was seen by the one person everyone else refused to look at. But in a school built on compliance, unauthorized connections are viewed as threats. The teachers didn't see a friendship forming. They saw a liability. They saw a good student being corrupted by a bad apple. And the system, blind and heavy, was getting ready to intervene. The intervention didn't come with a shout, but with a slip of pink paper placed quietly on Nellie's desk during math. In the lexicon of Oak Creek Elementary, a summons to the guidance office was usually reserved for the disruptors, the Calebs of the world. For a student like Nellie, whose entire school existence was predicated on being unnoticed, the pink slip felt like a subpoena. She packed her bag slowly, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on her back. When she walked out, she glanced toward the back of the room where Caleb sat, slumped low in his chair. He didn't look up, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his pencil. He knew what a summons meant. In his world, when authority called, it was never to give good news. Mrs. Vance's office was designed to be soothing. It smelled of lavender plug-ins and was decorated with posters featuring kittens hanging from branches with captions about hanging in there. But to Nellie, the room felt like an interrogation cell disguised as a living room. Mrs. Vance sat behind a desk cluttered with files, her face arranged in a mask of professional concern. A look that adults wear when they have already decided what the problem is and are simply waiting for you to agree with them. "Nellie," she began, her voice dropping to that hushed, conspiratorial tone meant to signal safety. "We've noticed, Mr. Henderson and I, that you've been spending your lunch periods with Caleb. We wanted to check in. Is everything okay?" Nellie sat on her hands to keep them from shaking. "Yes. Sometimes," Mrs. Vance continued, leaning forward, "students can feel pressured to give things away. Or they might feel intimidated by other students who are bigger or louder. Has Caleb asked you for food? Has he made you feel like you have to sit there?" "He doesn't ask," Nellie said, her voice small but steady. "He's just hungry. He eats like he hasn't had dinner." Mrs. Vance blinked. She picked up a pen and tapped it against a file folder. Caleb's file, thick and battered. "We have programs for lunch assistance, Nellie. That's not your responsibility. And frankly, Caleb has a history of volatile behavior. We're concerned about your safety. It's wonderful that you're kind, but you need to have healthy boundaries. You can't fix everyone." The words hung in the lavender-scented air. Boundaries, safety, liability. They were words that protected the school, not the child. When Nellie tried to explain about the flinching, Mrs. Vance nodded and wrote something down, but her eyes had glazed over. She wasn't listening to the data, she was following the protocol. "I think it's best," Mrs. Vance concluded, closing the file with a finality that sounded like a cell door slamming. "If you go back to your usual table tomorrow, let the professionals handle Caleb." When Nellie left the office, the hallway felt colder. The professionals had been handling Caleb for years, and the result was a boy who thought the world hated him. The fallout was immediate. The next day at lunch, Mr. Henderson stood like a sentinel near Caleb's table. When Nellie walked in with her tray, he caught her eye and gave a sharp shake of his head, pointing toward her old table. Nellie hesitated. Across the room, Caleb was watching. He saw the teacher block her path. He saw her pause, then turn away, defeated by the weight of authority. He didn't rage. He didn't throw his tray. He simply slumped, a collapse of the spine that said, "Of course." He looked at the empty chair across from him, then down at his hands. He didn't eat that day. The adults had underestimated the tenacity of a quiet rebellion. Nellie and Caleb moved the map. In the library, Nellie would leave a granola bar tucked behind the spine of a specific encyclopedia volume. In the hallway, she would catch his eye and give a barely perceptible nod. But it wasn't enough. Without that 20 minutes of peace, the pressure inside Caleb began to build again. The teachers watched him more closely, waiting for the slip-up, unaware they were compressing a volatile gas. Nellie watched from across the room, seeing the tension return to Caleb's shoulders. She knew the clock was ticking. The collapse happened on a Thursday afternoon during the stagnant heat of the final period. The air in the classroom was heavy, smelling of chalk dust and tired bodies. Caleb was agitated. Nellie could see it from 3 rows away. He wasn't causing trouble, but his body was vibrating with a restless, frantic energy. He was tapping his pencil against the desk. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythmic staccato that wasn't meant to annoy, but to soothe. It was the sound of a nervous system trying to regulate itself, a metronome keeping the chaos at bay. But to Mr. Hargrove, a teacher who had been battling a migraine since lunch, it was just defiance. "Caleb, stop the noise!" The command was sharp, cutting through the humidity. Caleb stopped for a second, his hand freezing in midair, but the silence that followed was too loud, too filled with the pressure of 30 students turning to watch. Within seconds, the tapping started again, faster this time, involuntary. It was a leak in the dam. Mr. Hargrove sighed, the heavy, performative sigh of an adult who has decided they are the victim, and marched down the aisle. The room held its breath. This was the moment the ecosystem had been waiting for. The predator was cornered. The warden was approaching. "I said stop," Mr. Hargrove snapped, reaching the desk. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't notice the sheen of sweat on Caleb's forehead or the way his eyes were unfocused, staring at a point somewhere through the floor. The teacher saw non-compliance, and because the school's policy was built on the idea that authority must be absolute, he made the mistake that would shatter everything. He reached out. It wasn't a strike. It was a simple, impatient attempt to grab the pencil, or perhaps to guide Caleb out of the chair. But he placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder without warning. For a child who has learned that sudden touches usually precede pain, the reaction isn't a choice, it's biology. It is the amygdala hijacking the brain before a single thought can form. Caleb exploded. He didn't just stand up, he erupted from the chair, his arms flailing in a desperate, blind attempt to create distance. His forearm connected with Mr. Hargrove's chest, a shove, clumsy and panicked. The teacher stumbled back, tripping over a backpack, and hit the whiteboard ledge with a loud, hollow thud. The room erupted. "He hit him!" someone screamed. The narrative was sealed in that instant. The reality that a frightened boy had flinched away from an unwanted touch was buried under the optical illusion of violence. Mr. Hargrove scrambled up, his face red with shock and indignation. He wasn't hurt, but his authority had been bruised, and in a zero-tolerance school, that was a capital offense. He reached for the wall phone, his voice shaking as he called the office. "I need security, now. He's assaulting staff." Assault. The word hung in the air, heavy and legalistic. It transformed Caleb from a 10-year-old in distress into a criminal suspect. Within minutes, the classroom was a theater of containment. 2 security guards, large men in uniforms that looked too much like police gear, filled the doorway. The principal arrived, barking orders to clear the room. The other students were herded out into the hallway, whispering and pointing, their fear mixed with the thrill of the spectacle. Nellie moved with them, but her eyes never left Caleb. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was backed into the corner near the coat rack, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and unseeing. He looked small, surrounded by 3 grown men shouting commands. "Hands where we can see him! Calm down or we will restrain you!" He looked like a rabbit surrounded by wolves. The rage that everyone else saw was gone, replaced by a terrifying, silent paralysis. He was waiting for the end. The system moved with cold efficiency. They didn't ask him why he was scared. They didn't call the counselor. They treated the incident as a threat to be neutralized. One guard moved in, grabbing Caleb's arm in a control hold that was designed for adults, not children. Caleb let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a high, thin keen of absolute despair. They marched him out, his feet barely touching the floor, parading him past the rows of lockers like a captured enemy combatant. Nellie stood by her locker, clutching her books to her chest. She felt a sickness rising in her throat. She saw what the adults refused to see. The assault was a flinch. The monster was a terrified boy. The school was treating a panic attack like a prison riot. They took him to the quiet room, a euphemism for a small, windowless office near the administration block used for in-school suspensions and police waits. It was a holding cell in everything but name. The door clicked shut. The lock turned. The principal was already on the phone with the district, discussing expulsion, discussing liability, discussing how to remove the problem permanently. They were discarding him. The hallway cleared. The bell rang. The world of Oak Creek Elementary tried to return to normal, satisfied that the danger had been contained. But Nellie stood staring at the closed door at the end of the hall. She knew that if she walked away now, if she went to her next class and followed the rules, Caleb would disappear. He would become just another file in a cabinet, another statistic of a system that failed him. The silence from behind that door was deafening. It was the sound of a child who had finally stopped hoping. In room 304, Mrs. Gable was explaining the denominator of a fraction, but Nellie couldn't hear the numbers. All she could hear was the silence echoing from the end of the hallway. She knew Caleb was alone. She knew the adults were writing the end of his story, and she knew it was the wrong ending. Nellie stood up. She gathered her things, the zip of her backpack sounding like a scream in the quiet classroom. Mrs. Gable turned, chalk in hand, her mouth forming a question, but Nellie was already moving. She walked out the door, crossing the threshold from the safe world of compliance into the dangerous territory of action. The hallway was empty, a long tunnel of polished linoleum that smelled of floor wax and institutional indifference. Usually, walking here without a pass would make Nellie's heart race with the fear of being caught. Today, she felt nothing but a cold, driving purpose. She walked past the trophy case, past the murals of smiling children holding hands, and straight toward the administrative block. The silence here was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a hospital waiting room or a court of law. When she pushed open the heavy double doors of the main office, the air changed. It was charged with crisis. The school secretary was on the phone, her voice a hushed whisper of scandal. The principal was standing by the filing cabinets, looking flushed and angry. And there, guarding the door to the quiet room, were 2 police officers. They looked enormous in the small space, their utility belts heavy with equipment designed for criminals, not 10-year-olds. They were the wall the system had built to keep the problem contained. Nellie didn't stop. She walked past the counter, ignoring the secretary's startled gasp. She walked right up to the wall of blue uniforms. "Hey kid," one of the officers said, stepping in to block her path. "You can't be back here. This is a secure area." Nellie didn't look at his face. She looked at the door behind him, a solid wood slab with a small reinforced wire glass window. She could see a shadow slumped in the corner of the room. He was in there. He was waiting for the end. "I said you need to leave," the officer repeated, his voice firm, expecting the automatic obedience that children usually offer. Nellie didn't leave. She dropped her backpack to the floor. Then she sat down. She crossed her legs, placed her hands in her lap, and fixed her eyes on the door. It was a small movement, but in the high-stakes tension of the office, it felt like a bomb going off. She was planting herself directly in the machinery of the system. "Nellie!" The principal hurried over, his voice tight with stress. "Get up. Go back to class immediately. You are interfering with police procedure." "He's not dangerous," Nellie said. Her voice was steady, though her hands were shaking against her knees. "He's scared. You scared him." "He attacked a teacher," the principal snapped. "He is out of control." "He flinched," Nellie corrected him, looking up for the first time. "Mr. Hargrove touched him. You don't touch him when he's loud. You wait." The police officer looked down at her, then at the principal. The certainty in her voice made him pause. The narrative of the violent offender was cracking. Nellie turned back to the door. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the wood. "Caleb?" she called out. The name hung in the air. From inside the room there was a shuffle. A shadow moved across the wire glass. "I have pretzels," she said. "I don't like them." It was a code. It was a lifeline. Inside the room, the sobbing stopped. The terrifying reality of the police and the suspension faded, replaced by the familiar ritual of the cafeteria. Caleb moved to the door. He didn't pound on it. He placed his hand against the glass, right where Nellie's head was resting. "They're gonna take me," his voice came through, muffled and small. "I'm staying right here," Nellie answered. The officer watched the interaction. He saw the monster inside the room press his hand to the glass in a gesture of desperate connection. He saw the victim outside the door refusing to be saved. The dynamic shifted. The threat assessment collapsed. The officer looked at the principal, his expression hardening, not toward the boy, but toward the situation. "Open it," the officer said. "We can't." "Open the door," he repeated. "He's a child. Let him out." When the lock clicked, Caleb didn't run. He sank to the floor in the doorway, burying his face in his knees. Nellie didn't crowd him. She just stayed where she was, sitting in the silence with him, the only person in the building who had been brave enough to be quiet. The shouting stopped, but the real work of repair was just beginning. The police officers left without filing a report, their heavy boots retreating down the hallway, leaving behind a silence that felt different than before. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of a reset button being pressed. The principal sat behind his desk, the expulsion paperwork suddenly feeling heavy and inappropriate in his hands. The narrative had broken. You couldn't expel a child who had just been talked down by a 10-year-old girl with a bag of pretzels. It forced a pause in the machinery. And in that pause, the school was forced to blink. The meeting that followed the next day wasn't the usual expulsion hearing. It was quieter, more uncomfortable for the adults. Nellie wasn't there, but her presence hung over the conference table like a judgment. The principal, the counselor, and Mr. Hargrove had to look at the file again. They had to look past the list of infractions and see the pattern Nellie had identified without a degree in psychology. They couldn't discard him now. Too many people had seen the truth. The police officer's comment had stung. The optics of arresting a crying child were impossible to defend. So, the system, creaky and reluctant, began to turn. They replaced the expulsion with a support plan. It wasn't perfect. It was a bureaucratic compromise born of liability concerns as much as care, but it was a start. Mr. Hargrove was moved to a different lunch duty, unable to watch the boy he had failed to understand. A cool-down pass was issued to Caleb, allowing him to leave class without permission if the noise became too much, a direct concession to the reality Nellie had exposed. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was an acknowledgement of his humanity. It was the school finally attempting to speak Caleb's language. Caleb returned on a Tuesday. He didn't come back as a model student. There was no movie magic transformation where he suddenly loved homework and smiled at teachers. He still wore the hoodie like armor. He still scowled when the hallway grew too crowded, but the terror was gone. He walked into the cafeteria not as a target, but as a boy with a destination. Nellie was there. The apple was there. The silence was waiting. The change rippled out in small, almost invisible waves. Mr. Henderson stopped standing over their table like a warden. He learned the watch from a distance, realizing that his proximity was the trigger, not the cure. Mrs. Vance stopped calling Nellie in for protection talks and started watching the corner table with a kind of confused respect. The teachers had to reckon with their own failure. They had to walk past that table every day and see the proof that their instincts had been wrong. It is a hard thing for an adult to learn from a child, that authority is not the same as control, and that compliance is not the same as connection. This is the hard truth about empathy that Nellie taught the school. It is not a soft, fluffy feeling. It is a discipline. It is the grueling, unglamorous work of sitting in the dark with someone until their eyes adjust. It is a heavy lift. Nellie didn't fix Caleb's home life. She didn't fix the underfunded school system or the peeling paint in the hallways. She didn't turn a bully into a saint. She simply offered a tether. She provided a single, stationary point in a spinning world, and that was enough to keep him from flying off the edge. By the end of the year, the table in the corner had changed. It wasn't just two of them anymore. A first grader, the same one Caleb had tripped months ago, had wandered over, looking for a place to sit away from the noise. Caleb hadn't invited him, but he hadn't kicked him out. He just moved his tray over an inch. It was a small movement, a microscopic shift in the geography of the cafeteria, but it was an earthquake in the heart of a boy who had once believed he was poison. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was just a decision to see the person behind the behavior. The noise of the world continued around them, but their space was defined by peace. Nellie didn't save the world, and she didn't fix the broken system that created the problem. But for one boy, she made the world survivable. She proved that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to fight the darkness, but simply to sit with someone inside it until they aren't afraid anymore. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet kindness, please like and subscribe for more.